Hi everybody, this is Susan Baxter and I thought I would do something different, so I'm going to use a different type of presentation for my presentation. I'm going to be using a Pechacucha, which will start on the next slide. And for those of you who are not familiar, a Pechacucha is a Japanese style of presentation where you use 20 slides and each slide stays on the screen for 20 seconds each. So that's how I will go through the actual presentation itself. When those 20 slides are over, I'll stop and debrief and go through the questions for our discussion board with you. Now, for any of you that think, "Ooh, that doesn't sound to my liking or to my learning style," please know that I will be putting my presentation along with my written notes on our discussion board. So if you'll notice that my presentation is very heavy in graphics, and if that's not to your learning style or your liking, you will have words, if you're a word person, available to you through the discussion board. So I hope that maybe it'll at least offer a little variety at this point in our semester. So at this point, I'm going to go ahead and start our Pechacucha. The presentation will cover the market model through a case study of Minnesota higher education. I begin the presentation with Chapter 8 from our course text, but we'll be adding outside sources further in the presentation. Our text describes Minnesota as a progressive state in terms of financing higher education, citing research centers and STEM as examples. Leading up to the development of the market model, Minnesota reacted to predictions that college enrollment post-1978 was going to decline. To be proactive, Minnesota froze basic appropriations at 1977 levels. This led to the formation of a task force to search and study new enrollment and finance approaches. In 1984, the Minnesota model was established but not implemented until 1988 and included a 12-cell matrix that was used to determine funding for individual institutions. Additionally, the state determined that 2/3 of the funding would come from state appropriations and 1/3 from tuition. Like we would expect, there was change over time. The MHECB, who had a great deal of authority and power, including the area of finance, was replaced by MOHE, who had less financial autonomy. By 2010, tuition rose to more than 1/3 of the average cost. Minnesota needed to make some modifications, and MOHE was the group to move them forward. The revised model included explicit responsibilities that fell to families to pay what they can, taxpayers to support higher ed through their contributions, and students would have a work loan burden. The implicit responsibilities, which would be shouldered entirely by the student, would be the cost of attendance beyond those outlined in explicit responsibilities. At this point, I'd like to supplement our text topics with some current data provided by MOHE through their 2014 report. All of the following charts and graphs come from this report. I have referenced the report at the end of the presentation, and I'm also going to include a link to the report in my discussion board post so you can easily access it should you want to. So let's begin by looking at high school preparation. Our text already described Minnesota's exemplary record in K-12 preparation. To supplement, let's look at AP passage rates. You see that all high school students except the Asian population are doing better than the national average on these tests. The bottom graph shows that 69% of these graduates go on to college after high school graduation. Are all races going to college? The top chart shows that the racial breakdown of the in-state college population using a 5-year average. There is a disparity in minority students that graduate from high school, which creates a gap. This is depicted on the far right. The top chart only looks at graduates. The bottom chart shows enrollment by race at each type of institution. Now let's see how those students are going to pay for college. Our text already told us that Minnesota left fully funded need-based grant aid behind in order to fund the market model. This means higher tuition and more loans. The top table represents the disbursement of all grants that do not need repaid. This includes need-based and merit-based. The bottom table represents all loans, federal, state, or private. Now, how are the tuition rates in Minnesota? The top chart looks at first-time full-time students in 2012-13 and compares tuition in Minnesota to peer states and the national average. Minnesota is above the national average in all the categories except private for-profit four-year institutions. The bottom chart shows the steady increase from 99 to 2013 in all areas. So it sounds like students in Minnesota are being asked to pay more and are expected to borrow more to fill the gap. The 2014 report states tuition has increased faster than income and inflation for over a decade. This is represented visually in the chart on the left. The borrowing that students are doing to make up for that difference is shown visually on the right. I put them side by side to show the parallels. The report states in Minnesota, 71% of first-time full-time freshmen receive grants or scholarships offsetting the price of attendance. The difference between the advertised price of a tuition and the average net price are shown on the top chart of the slide. Net price is set by family income. The bottom chart indicates that while overall tuition has risen considerably, net prices for lower income students receiving Title IV student aid have remained stable for the past 5 years. Minnesota undergraduates received $3.2 billion in financial aid in 2011-12. Student and families borrowed $1.3 billion in educational loans and received $1.4 billion in grants. Minnesota undergraduates were awarded aid at a lower rate than peer states and the national average. Okay, the same report tells us that lower income students are less likely to enroll full-time. The higher the family income, the greater the chance of full-time enrollment. There are advantages to full-time enrollment. The more credit hours you take, the cheaper it becomes. In essence, it's becoming easier for those who it's easiest to begin with. Okay, so let's move on. We've looked at getting them into higher ed. Now let's look at staying in the race and finishing the race. As you can see from the top chart, post-secondary persistence has remained consistent for the past 8 years, as has the graduation rate, which shows a minor increase. I think it's worth noting the overall consistency in both areas of persistence and graduation, and at a fairly high rate. This slide looks at the retention at a single institution. As indicated in the top table, Minnesota is 16th in the country for four-year institutions at 80% and 45th at two-year institutions at 52%. Several slides back, we looked at who went to each institution type, so I've created a chart at the bottom of the slide to recap that for you. Minnesota does have a high percentage of citizens who have attended college and graduated from college, as indicated in the top charts. The top chart on the left shows the steady incline since 1940, with Minnesota showing marked gains over the U.S. and other Midwest states. The bottom table shows that Minnesota is fourth overall in the percentage of states with an associate degree or higher. Let's see if all races are earning degrees in Minnesota. The top chart shows degree attainment by race. There are disparities between the races when you consider a 65% span and a gap of 20% between some groups. The bottom chart shows the percent who graduate within 150% of normal time, again broken down by race. So we're nearing the end of the Pechacucha, so this is the perfect time to look at graduates. And Minnesota has been increasing how many they have been producing over the past decade. Not only can you see a considerable increase, bachelor's degrees in particular, but when you look at the sum total, there's a lot of degrees being awarded. Well, that should be the end of our story. Everyone got a degree, everyone lived happily ever after, right? No, not really. Oh yeah, there was that debt issue. The top of the slide shows the average 2011 graduate with a bachelor's degree left with just under $30,000 in debt and will earn just under $40,000 in the first year out of college. The information does not tell us at what interest rate that will be paid back at, which varies considerably from federal, state to private loans. That leads us to the risk of default, which was visually represented at the chart at the lower right of the slide. Hope you enjoyed the Pechacucha. It was a mouthful. If you needed more text, or if I went too fast, and it was fast, and if you'd like to see my notes, I've definitely included my PowerPoint for you in the discussion board so that you can go through that at a pace that might be a little bit more comfortable for you. Or you might want to look at some of those graphs in more detail. But at this point, I would just like for us to go over some discussion of some discussion of what we might want to talk about in the discussion board with in our class slide, excuse me. So my first question I'd like to pose is, what do you think Minnesota is doing right that other states, including North Carolina, might want to emulate. Is there an area where you think we could learn from their mistakes? And so what is that area and why is it a mistake? So again, kind of just to recap that question, strengths and weaknesses. What are their strengths? What are their weaknesses? For my second question, take any one area that we explored in the Minnesota case study. We looked at high school preparation, college finance, college admissions, diversity in post-secondary education, college retention, college graduation, and college debt, and compare it to North Carolina using current data. Reflect and respond to the similarities and differences that you find. So just compare our state to their state in any one of those areas, and just say a little something about how you think we match up with them. Could be good, bad, and different, but just compare us. And a third and final question, the original model presented in the book has progressed into the current model used today in Minnesota. Based on your readings in the chapter and the updated 2014 data I shared in this presentation, do you feel that the model is strengthening, or weakening? And how do you think that performance funding will impact this model? At the end of the chapter in our text, they talk about in 2011 performance funding was introduced in Minnesota, and so how do you think that that is going to play a role in the picture overall as time goes on? So I've enjoyed creating the presentation for you, and I look forward to seeing how the discussion goes on the discussion board. Thank you very much. And there are my references.